Soundstripe.
Hello and welcome to our third episode of Demystifying Politics, the podcast where we help young people get involved in politics. Today's topics on the news are obviously the unfortunate demise of Prince Phillip, the second topic that Biden is looking to expand the Supreme Court, and finally, there was the attack on the nuclear facility in Iran and its implications for the wider region. Finally, our big question of the day is will the Iran deal ever come back? Nathan, do you want to start us off?
Of course. On Friday the 9th of April, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, passed away at Windsor Castle just a few months before his 100th birthday. This news was met with sadness across the country and across the world, though there was some criticism of his life's work. What does his death mean for the national scene? Dev, so what were your initial reactions to the news?
Obviously, sadness, a little bit of disbelief because honestly, I thought they would live forever. But yeah, I think he was obviously, a pretty decent man. Did a lot of good charity work. When it comes to the criticism of him in terms of his comments, I mean, I think half of them were jokes, and then half of them were, I think, relics of a time long gone, if you know what I mean. He was born in the 1920s, so we can't really expect him to be absolutely politically correct to the dot. But I don't think I genuinely don't think he was racist in any way. So yeah, I think sadness in terms of wider implications for the monarchy, not too much. The only thing I can see really happening is maybe a slight pushback from some people, because of his death, the BBC's now had now 7 or 8 days of just wall-to-wall coverage of Prince Philip. It might just annoy some people. Just be like, oh well, this is and some people have compared it to North Korea, but I think that's a bit extreme. But some people might be a bit annoyed that for 7 days we're almost respecting a man, unnecessarily. So that's the only real pushback I can see happening from this.
Obviously, in the 21st century, Britain is one of the only remaining monarchies in the world. Should we make such a big deal of the death of a monarch, or should we treat it as of the death of any other celebrity?
Yeah, I think with the monarchy, Britain is a very normal country, and the only kind of weird thing, the only spicy thing, if you know what I mean, about it is our monarchy. I think that's what interests a lot of countries. In fact, which is why we get so much tourist money from the US and from Europe, because the Americans care more about the royal family than we actually do ourselves. Because for them, it's their government it's a president. It's very democratic, secular, whatnot, and they've almost lost the grandiose of having a monarchy. Now, of course, I think there's arguments, very good ones as well, for abolishing it, but the grandeur, the kind of the almost awe-inspiring nature of the monarchy itself, that's what makes a lot of people come. I personally think, yeah, I think the idea of a monarchy is quite outdated, but I do see the attracting factor, and I think this is one of the times it's not too bad. I mean, how many other countries a person pretty famous dies, and now every news presenter has to wear black. The BBC isn't allowed to play inoffensive music, and then we have wall to wall coverage. I kind of think it's slightly cool. It's one of the few good things about the monarchy. But I do think the monarchy as an idea itself is a bit outdated. What do you think?
Well, I have quite a few comments on this. So Prince Philip, as many of you will know, fought in the Royal Navy in World War II at between pretty much the ages of 18 and 21. So very young man fighting in one of the largest wars in human history. He's sort of the face of a country that is now leaving us. We definitely have relics of the fact that World War II happened. I mean, buildings were rebuilt. We have the NHS because of it. We have the welfare state because of it. But nearly everyone that was of that generation has died or is dying. And Prince Philip has gone with them. Now, Prince Philip is also the death of Prince Philip also means the end of the sort of era in which leaders were actual military figures. So I'm sure we've all learned in our history classes about men like Henry VIII and William I, who went out onto the battlefield, fought in wars for glory, and by their standards for God. Prince Philip also was a military man, a midshipman with the very lowest rank, rose to lieutenant during over the course of the war, and that to many people that makes him a hero.
Yeah,
Nowadays, obviously, we live in a much more peaceful world, and many would say, well, it's a good thing we don't have war anymore. But it will be strange to no longer so explicitly associate the royal family with uh, military prowess and military acumen.
yeah, I was just going to say that I think it makes a few people a bit nostalgic for like the times of Alexander the Great, Napoleon, all these all-out conquering great warlords. Not warlords, that's a bad one. Great men of war who went out and went into the field, inspired their men, and went on like imperialist conquests. I do think that time is gone now. And while that was like a great part of our history. I do think it's a part of our history that's now gone, and we become more civilized. But I do admit that there is a certain like nostalgia for the days when we had great men of great like will and intelligence and strength who would go out themselves into the battlefield and conquer for king and for country. So yeah, I think that's there's a bit of nostalgia for that.
Or do you think there's any sort of replacement for that then? Uh, because otherwise, what purpose does the military serve if they're no longer military commanders? What are they there for?
I think with the military, I think with as war as all out, there's obviously wars still in around the world. You see, there's plenty in the Middle East. I think as large scale war quietened down, especially in Europe and the West, I think the military takes on a role that is a less role, an inferior role in domestic politics. And I think politicians who are elected democratically then take on a more significant importance. So whereas previously we were like a bunch of warring nations all ready to kind of try to throw it down, as more international solidarity and more brotherhood is started to seep in and globalization has started to occur. We've and I think it's a good thing, by the way, that war no longer happens. I think the military will take a more inferior role. I think it'll become more about soft power and diplomacy, and how and imperialism will go into its next stage. So what I mean by that is, so think of like the empires of the world. So the British Empire was very explicit. They would go to a country and they'd say it's mine. That it's pretty explicit. The US Empire was a bit more like a bit more hiding. Like they would what they would do.
Yeah, it was much less explicit. I mean, there was the occupation of places like the Philippines, but it was much more occupation via owning companies, owning
Exactly.
industry,
And
owning
what
agriculture.
exactly what they would do is they would, if a you what they would think was that the world, they'd have a sphere of influence, and if any country elected a leader that wouldn't bow down to the US's interests, they would just institute a coup to overthrow their government. That happened in plenty of places around the world, too many to mention. So that's, and now China's coming in as its new power, and what they're using as their stage of imperialism is because war is scaling down. They have something called the Belt and Road Initiative, whereby they go to these poor countries, they build their infrastructure. The poor countries now owe them a lot of debt, and now they're kind of beholden to Chinese interests. You can see this like when all the Uyghur Muslim that sort of outrage was happening, like 60 African and like Pakistan and all these like poor countries where China had been building infrastructure, they all signed a letter being like, yeah, we shouldn't blame China about the Uyghur Muslims thing. It's nothing to worry about. So you can always
Yeah,
see
lots of people were confused as to why Muslim nations
yeah,
supposedly were on the side of China who were oppressing Muslims. But yeah, it's the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been called neo-colonialism by some. They don't believe that it's in good faith, and they believe that it's akin to, say, the British involvement in India.
yeah, and I think what's basically going to happen now is we're going to replace these. What's going to happen is the world's going to go away from war, and we're going to have more like implicit warfare, but whereby it's more like soft power and diplomacy and like allyships and NATO and whatnot. And then also cyber warfare will become, as we'll talk about later actually this week, cyber warfare will take on an even more enhanced and important role.
I'd actually just like to challenge the idea that the sort of democratic absolutism. So I think in the past, I'd say 70 years or so, with the end of fascism, and then in the 90s with the collapse of the Soviet Union, liberal democracy has sort of come to the forefront of the world, particularly the West, as the only viable political ideology. So any sort of ideology that disregards public opinion or that draws its power from something else than voting every 4 or 5 years is seen as irrelevant, authoritarian, unworkable. Is that really the best way through? Because it's not as if liberal democracy is perfect. We've definitely had political, social, and economic problems over the past 20 or 30 years. So, do you think democracy is to be deified? Do you think, are there any potential problems you see with liberal democracies?
I think it's the answer is two pronged here. I think you're right in terms of there are successful authoritarian countries around the world, and to say that they aren't would be foolish to say so. Singapore, for example, has an authoritarian government, one party state, zero freedom of speech, not much political freedoms, but everyone's extremely happy because the standard of living is extremely high. Another example of this would be China, whereby they pair capitalism and economic growth with an authoritarian government, and some are seeing this as like the perfect mix. What I would say is I think you can have like the economic growth and the raising of living standards within a democracy, and so I personally would prefer democracy because I think yes, democracy is completely imperfect. As Winston Churchill once famously said, the best argument against democracy is a conversation with the average voter, um, which I completely agree. I think democracy, the way we can improve democracy is by having a more educated populace. The more educated the populace, the better democracy will be. So we need to make sure people are educated and see what their votes can be used for. But yeah, I think democracy is an imperfect system, but I do think it is still a better system than the one you see in Singapore or China, because I still think the idea, the very basic fundamental idea of power to the people, whereby the state serves the people and not itself, is a very powerful one, and I think it's still a very compelling basis on which to build your society.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether in future weeks we can further go into discussions about how
Yeah,
much power executive officers should have, how much
it,
power legislature should have, how much power the people should have in general. Should we move on? Shall we move on to our second topic?
yeah, sure. Yeah, I think we could have this question as a big question in the future. So yeah, the second one. Do you want to introduce it, Nathan? It's about Biden and the
Of course. On Friday, the 9th of April, Biden ordered signed an executive order opening a commission into expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court of the United States is often called the highest court of the land, and is the final court that decides whether or not only cases pass whether cases passed in lower down courts meet standards of constitutionality, or whether laws passed by Congress or signed by the president meet standards of constitutionality. So their intended purpose is to interpret the law and see whether it violates things like freedom of speech or separations of powers or rights to free and fair trials and so on. Now, currently, the Supreme Court has 9 justices, and Trump appointed 3 of them. So, 3 of the past 9 justices have been appointed by Trump, most controversially, Amy Coney Barrett, just before the election. So, and really, the Supreme Court's always been political, but definitely since Roe v. Wade, it's sort of the political nature of it has been increased, and therefore parties often wish to expand the number of justices so they can appoint their own justices that will uh, impose their idea of what constitutional means onto laws. Dev,
Yeah,
do you think it's fair of the Biden government to expand the courts?
I think with the that's the the Biden with the idea of expanding the Supreme Court. I think there's a lot of progressives that seem to really like this idea, and I find it pretty strange. I think it's very narrow sighted in terms of what it thinks. Because yes, of course, the Supreme Court has now become basically an added like an added political body now. Unfortunately, under the U.S. Constitution, of course, it's the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branch, with the executive and the legislative branch intended to be the ones that are political and the judicial meant to be independent. Unfortunately, now it's all three that are political. And if you really want to get some proper, real change in America, you need a majority in the House, supermajority in the Senate, majority in the Supreme Court, and the presidency. If you really want to get a transformational, anything's basically happen. So I think with if you did were to expand the Supreme Court, let's say Biden added three justices and they go to 12, well then, because of the nature of American democracy and the two-party state, a Republican president's going to come in at some point. Let's say in after Biden's second, say 2032, he's going to add maybe another three Republicans because then a Democrat will come in, three, and they'll become what? We'll end up with like 100 Supreme Court justices. Like where does this end? I think nine is a good number because 4-4, and then there's a tiebreaker. It's been what's been happening for ages. It seemed unwise to and short-sighted to politicize the Supreme Court in this way by expanding the court. I don't know why it's become now for a lot of progressives. It's strange to me, a sort of litmus test that all candidates should think about expanding the Supreme Court. I think that a lot of the times, yes, you do want to make sure that the Supreme Court is on your side. So maybe you can think about something like term limits. That would make more sense to me. Or yeah, a slight more maybe democratizes the Supreme Court a bit more, like in the 1900s they democratized the Senate. But I think honestly expanding it is out of all the reforms they could do, this Supreme Court, it's one of the worst ones. Maybe they could even consider like weakening how much power the judiciary has on overturning laws put through by Congress. But apart from that, honestly, I think there's a much more viable reforms, and I think expanding the Supreme Court is foolhardy from if Biden were to do it, and it's pretty short-sighted. What do you think about it?
It's important to remember that the idea of the Supreme Court has sort of been infiltrated and destroyed from almost the very beginning of the Republic. So initially, the Supreme Court was supposed to have almost no power, and it didn't have the power to check laws until after 1800. So it was about for the first 10 or 15 years, it was just dealing with cases from the lower courts, and it wasn't really a lawmaking body in the sense. Then the case Marbury versus Madison passed. Now, this case was important in that the Supreme Court almost gave itself the power to check on and act as a second legislature. So the political problem has existed and persisted in the Supreme Court for a very long time. Now, another problem is that there are no explicit requirements for Supreme Court justices, and there's very little regulation of the Supreme Court in the Constitution. So whereas with the presidency, you have to be 35 to be a president, 30 to be a senator, 25 to be in the House of Representatives. No such requirement, not for education, not for age, not for residency, exists in the Supreme Court. So technically, a 5-year-old in Myanmar could be nominated for the Supreme Court, which gives you some idea. Well, obviously that's not going to happen, but it gives you some idea of how little regulation there is on it. So I think the best idea would be to either to have an amendment capping the number, also an age requirement and an education requirement. However, I don't think that's going to happen given the adversarial nature of electoral politics.
I think I think the educational requirement is probably unnecessary because most of them go to like Harvard Law School anyway. I think like 6 out of 9 have been there. So I think most of them are pretty smart. I think when it comes to judicial review, which is what you were referring to, whereby the judiciary can overturn laws it deems to be unconstitutional, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing generally for liberal democracy. You don't want someone coming in and just
no, I definitely agree that it's a good thing, but
yeah, but I think
got to
maybe
remember that it's not
a bit more a bit like I'm talking about tepid reform because I don't want this to go in the wrong direction. I'm talking tepid reform on judicial review to make sure it's not like got politicized and it's actually unconstitutional. Some type of reform there, maybe some sort of term limits. That's the reform I would consider. I think I agree with you there.
I don't
Um,
actually support term limits. That's the only regulation that I don't support because the way I see it, the Supreme Court is supposed to be a body of elder wisdom, a learned body, and therefore arbitrarily saying after 10 or 15 years you've got to go. I don't really think that the US would benefit from that. However, I do think the US would benefit from appointments that aren't explicitly partisan, which the Amy Coney Barrett one obviously one was, and pretty much every appointment since 2000. I think another important statistic is that until Clarence Thomas's nomination, so Clarence Thomas is the only Black Supreme Court justice, and he was appointed. Uh, he was appointed in the 80s, I believe.
yeah, there was the Anita Hill scandal as well around that time.
Yeah. So until then, pretty much the entirety of the Senate would vote to affirm a Supreme Court justice. There'll be something like 96-4 to affirm a justice that was clearly partisan. So that was very interesting that senators didn't try to obstruct justices from being nominated. But obviously, back in October, when Amy Coney Barrett was nominated, massive scandals, massive hearings, very controversial votes. So I can't actually explain why that's happened because it's always been political. We're just seeing the overflow of that now.
Yeah, I think with that, I mean, it's kind of it's really unfortunate to see the politicization in the US of the Supreme Court, but now it's inevitable because I think it's a result of the power that the Supreme Court has given itself via judicial review. Um, because if it didn't have the power to do that, then no one really cared. But then again, if it didn't have the power to overturn laws it deemed to be unconstitutional, what would really be the point of the Supreme Court? I mean, at least politically, they still do, of course, like important cases. Um, I think what we have to be the reason as well. I think was accelerated the politicization of the court is the ineffectiveness of the U.S. legislature because of the filibuster and the fact that you basically can't get anything done unless you have like 60 votes. What's happened is the way every president now rules is you sign a batch of executive orders, just overturning the previous president's executive orders. You can't even do much via executive order, and then you can't do anything else because you'll pass something in the House and then it just won't go through the Senate. So you'll do some executive orders and then you'll maybe hope and then you can't do anything about it. So the Supreme Court is now basically done most of the major decisions. Roe v. Wade. Let's talk a lot of the
Then
voting.
also the gay marriage passing,
The gay marriage, of
Obergefell
course.
versus Hodges.
Exactly, Herbert versus Oges. Then also there was a lot of the election like mail-in balloting laws. A lot of that was done by the Supreme Court. Some birth control stuff by the Supreme Court as well. Contraceptives. So basically, all like the liberal, or basically all even the Citizens United, so the Republican one. So all the big ticket, reforms that the Democrats and Republicans have been pushing have now basically been done by the Supreme Court because of how ineffective the legislature and the presidency themselves are. So I think that what could also try and make the Supreme Court work a bit better would be making the legislature more work better.
Yeah, what do you think is? I assume you then that you support getting rid of the filibuster. Uh,
Oh, yeah, I absolutely do, and I think there's some progressives that are like, oh well, what if we're in the minority? Well, that's fine because the way politics does and should work, and it's the way it works in the UK, thank God at least, is you get elected by popular mandate. The people say, okay, we've given you both houses, do something. And if you do something and it improves their lives, you get elected again. And if you do something and it worsens their life, they'll kick you out. That's how it works. It shouldn't be minority rule. It shouldn't be that you win and then you can't still govern because of some arcane rule. That's, by the way, not even in the constitution. It's just popped out of nowhere. Well, not out of nowhere. That's a long
Actually,
story.
just to explain, a filibuster is where a politician decides that they know if something goes to vote, they'll inevitably lose. So what they do is to prevent the vote from occurring, they extend the debate. Now, sometimes they extend the debate by speaking for longer on the topic, but often they go off on a tangent, don't talk about anything relevant. So a very prominent example of this was when Obamacare was going to debate in the Senate. Ted Cruz decided to read like a very long marathon of just reading Dr. Seuss poetry. So I think for about 12 hours he just stood
Maybe
there.
that's why they cancelled Doctor Seuss.
Yeah, so just for like ages, Ted Cruz stood there reading books like Green Eggs and Ham.
Yeah, I think yeah, the and a lot of the time, like, in fact, now they don't even talk. They just say, "Yeah, I'm filibustering," and it just the filibuster happens. Do you want to move on now to the should I move on to the Iran on terror
Yeah,
attack? Yeah, okay. So for our last piece of news in the day, so recently a Iran nuclear facility has been attacked in what Iran describes as a terrorist incident. It is widely believed and basically widely admitted that it was the Israelis that carried it out. Of course, they themselves haven't admitted to it, but it's pretty well known. This follows earlier in the week an Iranian cargo ship in the Red Sea was attacked by the Israelis. Of course, they again didn't say it was them. It was, of course, accused of being a quote unquote spy ship by both the US and the Israelis, which was probably true to a certain extent. So, what we'll try and discuss is like the implications for the wider region, and what I think is very interesting is this comes just as Biden's team has taken the first diplomatic steps to renegotiate the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal. Which, what basically, for those who don't know, the Iran nuclear deal essentially what it did was Iran had a bunch of sanctions put on it by the US and they'd frozen a lot of its assets and put a lot of sanctions because of its pursuit of a nuclear weapons program. Its pursuit of the nuclear weapons program was said by the CIA and a bunch of other experts to be basically in self-defense because they feared Israel would attack them. So what the US and Iran came to agreement was Iran would stop making nuclear weapons, and they checked that through UN inspectors, and the US would give back its money, Iran's money, by unfreezing their assets. So that was working pretty well for a while, and Iran was complying with the deal because its economy was growing and people getting happier. And then Trump came in and falsely believed either he was mad about it because of an Obama rhetoric or generally because a lot of right wingers for some reason don't think that we should be engaging with Iran. He pulled out of the deal, which is a violation of international law, and then increased sanctions upon Iran. And then Iran were like, "Yeah, I think we're going back to making our nuclear weapons in order to pressure the US to go back to the deal because the deal was quite good for them." So Biden ran on the election that he would come back into the deal, and he's now taking the first steps to come back. And Israelis, incidentally, have attacked Iran twice in the space of a week, and that is because they don't want the US to be in that deal because they view Iran as an adversary and not someone you should be negotiating with. So I think they're just trying to make life harder for Biden. I think there's the implications. What do you think, Nathan?
so I think the real reason why Republicans are so hesitant to engage with Iran is because number one, because of their alliance with Saudi Arabia, primarily for economic reasons, but also because of the size of the Israeli lobby and the United States government. So for quite a long time now, um, lobbies like lobbies and organizations like APAC, which is the American Israeli Political Action Committee, have essentially lobbied American politicians to pass because obviously Israel is pretty much one of the only countries is is opposed by on all sides by countries that are hostile to their interests and to their existence. So because of that, Israel often seeks the help of nations like the US. So Israel often lobbies American politicians to send them more money and aid or to pass bills that attack their enemies. So I think that's the main reason why Republicans are so cautious to engage with Iran. But also just because there's engaging with Iran is just the appearance of globalism. Even if it were to benefit all parties, I think a lot of people would be uh, hesitant to do something that was seen as empowering international governments. Lots of people want governments closer to home, and therefore they don't want any sort of foreign deals of that nature. Now, my personal opinion of this is that I think it's best to say that under current circumstances, I don't think the Iran nuclear deal can ever go back to what it was before, given the sort of brash nature in which it was sort of thrown out of the window. I think there have to be completely new negotiations. We have to go completely from square one, um, potentially to something that replicates the Iran nuclear deal. Although, yeah, I think probably eventually something that replicates the Iran nuclear deal. Although I don't know how possible that is, given that Israel is adamantly opposed to it.
I think you touched on a very interesting point, which is the power and influence of the Israel lobby in the US. Of course, there's AIPAC and there's various other lobbying groups that are essentially arms of the Israeli government, acting in their interests. And I think, yeah, I think the issue, there's a lot of hurdles the JCPOA, honestly, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, faces to coming back. Because in Iran, you've got moderates and hardliners. So the hardliners are now laughing on their high chair, like, "Hey, we told you, moderates. Why engage with the US? They'll just turn your back on you. We'll just stay in. We'll keep doing our nuclear weapons and we'll keep repressing our people." So then the hardliners, of course, in Iran themselves, they don't want to go back to the deal. Then, of course, the Israelis and the Saudi Arabians both trying to increase tensions with Iran in order to stop the deal from happening because they view Iran as an adversary. Then, even within the US, Republicans don't want the US to go into the Iran nuclear deal. And in order, by the way, in order for any treaty to be ratified by the Senate, it needs to be ratified by the Senate, which may be hard to do because there's still 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. Um, and then, of course, it just Biden himself seems to be taking the Trump line on this, which is that Iran should stop doing its nuclear weapons, and then the US will go back to the deal, which is strange given the US themselves pulled out of it. So yeah, I think it faces a lot of hurdles. I think if where there is a will, there may be a way. And I'm not sure Biden right now is showing the will, partly because he's so focused on his own domestic politics, which is why it's sort of, it's not really at the forefront of his mind right now. It may be slightly later on when domestic politics itself is cooled down and he has time to focus on foreign policy. Um, yeah, I think
I
that
think it's very. I don't think Biden wants to deal with any sort of foreign affairs because on the domestic front, things are looking upwards. I mean, massive vaccinations in the US, uh, economic growth looking up, S&P 500 looking up, Dow Jones looking up. I don't think he wants to draw attention to an area in which the US isn't very strong at the moment.
Yeah, and there's a lot of research showing that the US is about to enter a new roaring 20s, whereby a decade of huge economic prosperity. Biden's got higher approval ratings, vaccine rollout, consumer confidence is high. It's all looking up for Biden domestically, and he just wants to ride that wave. And so, engaging in like messy foreign politics just isn't very appealing to him right now. So yes, it could be revived if there's political will, but Biden just doesn't have the political will to do so right now. Do you think we should move on to the big question of the day?
Yeah, of course.
Yep. Okay. I think I'll introduce it. So our big question of the day is: will the Iran deal ever come back? We've touched on this already, so this is just it's a really nice segue into the Iran deal. So, of course, as we've said right now, there's a lot of pressure from all sides with regards to the Iran deal. The Israelis don't want it to happen. The Saudis don't want it to happen. The hardliners in Iran don't want it to happen. The Republicans in the US don't want it to happen. The only people that want this to happen is the Democrats, Biden, and some of the moderates in Iran. And it doesn't appear that Biden has the political will to, really go through these hurdles and try and get something done. So, yeah, Nathan, do you just want to continue our discussion, basically?
So I'm of the opinion that there can never really ever, there's never going to be peace and coexistence between the United States and Iran. Either Iran will, either the US will wipe Iran off the map and institute a American puppet government, or Iran will destroy the state of Israel and move all American military bases out of the Middle East and West Asia. As to which of those will happen, I do not know, but I do not see a situation in where number one, Biden demonstrates lots of will and exerts lots of effort into getting this deal back. And number two, I don't see a situation in which the Iranian government accepts such a deal, given their death to America stance.
Yeah, actually, I'm a bit more of a cheery, hopeful guy than you. You're sounding kind of pessimistic, I think. So yeah, I think there is a possibility of peaceful coexistence between the US and Iran. And I think what we need to do is embolden the moderates in the Iran regime and try and embolden some sort of reform. And if Iran is to engage with the US, and the JCPOA was the first example of real engagement with the West, we have to show that the US is a trusted ally and we can work with them. Iran can work with the US. And then, Iran took a big step. It took a leap of faith. It trusted the US, like, yeah, we'll go into this deal. And now the US just, now, a couple of years ago, they pull out out of nowhere. And so Iran's sitting here thinking that why, and the hardliners are saying, why should we even trust the US? So I think if we want peaceful coexistence to happen, we would need to embolden the moderates, and that can only happen if we show that the US is a real ally that it can work with. I think, yeah, and I think where reform most comes is when living standards increase mostly. So I think that with if we help to lift sanctions on Iran and we improve the economy and we really try and bring it into the fold of the world, I don't think it's a massive. I think the Israel and Saudi Arabia like to, although of course the Iran regime, don't get me wrong, I don't want to sort of sympathize with Iran. It's one of the worst regimes in the world, alongside North Korea. And it's repression of people. It's one of the worst regimes. I don't think it's. I think genuinely that if we were to engage with it properly, that and try and encourage social and economic reform there can be peaceful coexistence. But I think you could be right too. One of the two will happen.
Yeah, well, the reason why I don't think coexistence will happen is because your definition of coexistence sort of seems to be that Iran is liberalized, they become sort of a Western nation, and that necessitates removing the Sharia government by force. So, so either Iran is just completely raised and a new democratic purge is put in its place, or the opposite happens, and that's why I'm quite pessimistic.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to be pessimistic. I have to be honest. It is quite a hardline regime, and similar to North Korea, it really builds its legitimacy of the US and a hatred of the US, because most of the people probably hate the regime, but the regime can just be like, yeah, the US is the doer of all evils, and that's why you're oppressed. But I do think that there could be regime change in Iran. I doubt Biden will be the one to institute it, as we said before, domestically he's riding very high, and he doesn't really seem to want to do so. But I could see like a Ted Cruz or a Republican coming in next term and instituting regime change there. Yeah, I mean, what do you think?
First of all, just to give some background, up until 1979, Iran was very similar to Western nations. I mean, it was a monarchy, but it didn't have uh, state Islam imposed upon its citizens. And ever since then, they have had a theocratic government. And also, unlike other smaller nations that the US often deals with, unlike North Korea, unlike Venezuela, Iran is a serious power. So it's not a case of we can ignore them. They are it's an absolutely massive country. Currently has a population of in the currently has a population of 83 million. So it's not just a small country that we can sort of ignore and think it's not going to have any wider implications. Do I think force is the best way to an all out invasion is the best way to deal with this? No, but the US does need to explore military preparation.
Um,
I thought all their efforts to create sort of democratic hegemony is going to collapse.
yeah, I think I'd have to disagree with you there because I don't see Iran as a serious threat. I mean, it spends much less compared to other Arabic nations in terms of its military spending. The US, so Israel and Saudi Arabia far bypass. It doesn't even have nuclear weapons. Of course, Israel is the only one that has nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Although it tried to, its entire pursuit of the nuclear weapons domestic thing is just to basically get the US to lift sanctions of it and in order to let its economy grow. So I think whilst the regime itself is a quite a despicable regime, I think that we could easily it could easily be disarmed as a threat to the US if we were just to allow it to exist a bit more and not try to listen to Israel when it comes to sort of trying to strangle it out of existence. If there's a lot of quite despicable regimes all around the world, and I think that Saudi Arabia, in fact, is basically the same as Iran when it comes to the oppression of its people. So I do think
Yeah,
that
I mean, the only difference really is that Saudi Arabia is amicable to American economic interests. They're willing to sell oil to the Americans, and
exactly,
therefore the
and
Americans need
therefore
to.
they're deemed to be fine. Um, did you have anything more to say on this topic?
Well, I think I will just close with this. Since the end of World War II, America has come to the forefront as the world's sole superpower. Unlike the British Empire of old, it's not a colonial government. They aren't sending colonial officers overseas to sit in the palaces of Tehran and Pyongyang and Caracas. However, they have tried to set up military bases in an effort to push governments in certain direction. Military bases in order to push governments in certain direction. How sustainable is this? I will find out, and I think that'll be the key question. How sustainable is this sort of military base rule of law?
I agree.
I think that brings us to a close.
I think thanks you guys for tuning in to our latest episode. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram. The links are in our bios wherever you're watching it. Catch us on Spotify, Breaker, Apple Podcasts, wherever else. See you guys next week.